Hello, I'm George Listenzier. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Like the mythical dragon of its ancient legends, China occupies a place in the Western imagination that rivals the massive dimensions of its landmass and the growing promise of its future. This has been true for ages, but in the shifting power landscapes of the 21st century, it is crucial that the West, and particularly the United States, gain a precise understanding of China's ambitions and capacities. Anything less than that raises the risk of conflict as China moves to its new position within the company of nations. Fortunately, there are helpful guidelines for gauging the intentions of China's leaders. They draw upon China's history and available evidence of the ambitions and frustrations of China's masses. They also take into account the somewhat improbable marriage of China's economic and political systems. With me to discuss this is the distinguished China expert and current public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, Dr. Ross Terrill. Ross, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you, George.
It's a delight to have you here to talk about this. Actually, Ross, it's a delight to talk to you about anything, but particularly China. And let me begin not by talking about China or asking about China, but rather about us, we Americans. And that is the, well, I alluded to it in the open, the sense that, and I pose it as a question, do we have this kind of special romantic regard for China based on everything from the ancient fabled myths of Cathay to the missionary past that we've had with that country? Does it have a special place in the American psyche?
Well, it has a special place, which is neither good nor bad. The trait you mentioned, I think, originated because of distance. The immediate neighbors, Japan and Russia, have not had this fantasy about China. They've not had the volatility quite that we have had. So I think distance, a big ocean there between us, and so China was a luxury for us for a long time, take it or leave it. The missionaries, as you mentioned, because they had the gospel in their pocket for China, there was a feeling that it was their China. They knew what it was, if only to say that it was in need of the gospel. Then the early trade between America and China was quite romantic in reality. Those clipper ships
exactly in the
sailing
South China
from
Sea,
Salem, near where I now live in Massachusetts, and down the Cape and up to Canton. Meanwhile, the United States didn't have a governmental involvement, so the British did all the dirty work of opening the treaty ports, banging down the door, bringing opium to trade for tea, and getting a basis for the American missionaries and traders to do their work. But it was, as I say, a bit of a luxury. We didn't need the trade, and I suppose the missionaries could have gone elsewhere. But then when they did get to China, as you also alluded, they found something extraordinarily different. What were these chopsticks? I mean, where's the knives and forks? And why do they have white colour for a funeral? It should be black. All these things. So there is an enchantment about difference.
That enchantment, that exoticism, so to speak, is beautifully described, Ross. I could see those ships as you spoke, the Greek clippers. I love sailing anyway. But did it lead, has all of that fed into, if not led, to a kind of a mythic conception of China that has persisted quite a long time? I guess what I'm driving for here is, has in any sense, and here I think of FDR and the heroic image of Chiang Kai-shek during World War II and then later, has it contributed to our policy approaches to China in any way? Have we looked at it in rose-colored glasses, even analytically?
Well, both demonizing and rose-colored glasses. We've had a bit of each. The FDR period is one where, as you say, Chiang Kai-shek was built up. Roosevelt insisted to Churchill and Stalin that Chiang Kai-shek be one of what he called the four world policemen to dictate the shape of the post-1945 world. But the view of Mao in the FDR period was very indulgent because the chief concern was anti-fascism. And everyone who was anti-fascist, in Mao's case against the Japanese attack on China, was presumed to be a Democrat.
This is fascinating stuff, Ross. Mao comes right into the story. We're going to talk about him. But that view from the American and the Soviet sides were equally unrealistic about Mao, weren't they?
They were.
In different ways, perhaps.
And here, I think the American background did count, because the missionaries and the traders weren't interested in Marxism, or they weren't interested in the state-to-state issues or balance of power, all that kind of thing. And Mao was practicing what the communists call united front, that the target of today is not the real target. You unite with anyone you can unite with for the first phase, and then you switch. And that's what he did with us, and it caused the reaction in 1949 when, as it was put, we lost China. It made the reaction all the stronger, because Mao then declared China's tomorrow is the Soviet Union's today, and all the hopes in China were turned into fears. So there was a letting him off the hook in the FDR period, and then the Korean War was the big difference. That changed everything.
In that period of the more the rosier view of Mao on the American side, I got the sense they saw him as essentially a kind of a muscular agrarian reformer, if you will, who would be very interested in agrarian reform, and the Soviets, for their side, actually doubted his communist credentials, didn't they? I mean, there's that famous radish right on the outside.
Exactly. Stalin called Mao a radish. But some of our diplomats bought that too readily. Patrick Hurley, who was FDR's special representative, he ran the same line, and when he was challenged on it, he said, "Stalin told me that they're not really communists." But the tragedy of that period was that there wasn't a sufficient understanding in the United States of Chinese political culture. The press corps in the wartime capital of Chongqing, including some famous names like Theodore White, they lionized Chiang Kai-shek for a while. Then they were disenchanted, and they didn't quite realize, I believe, the extraordinary difficulties that Chiang Kai-shek had in fighting the Japanese invasion and the communist insurgency, as we'd now call it. And I think a chance was missed for a coalition government during World War II, which, when Mao was still a little bit fluid about certain things. Of course, that doesn't mean Mao wasn't a communist, but if you're weak, you have to compromise.
That's exactly so.
And when the Marshall Mission, the famous Marshall Mission, occurred after World War II, it was too late. Chiang Kai-shek was too weakened, and we fell between two stools. We didn't vigorously support Chiang Kai-shek, and we didn't mediate in time to get a coalition.
Because of those failures and because of the triumph of Mao and of communism in China, what happened next, even I can remember from that time, was the very bitter cries of the loss of China in this country and its effect on sinology as a field in America. I'd like you to look both backwards and forwards, Ross, at that period and now. First of all, did we sort of what was the cost of that? The sort of ferreting out of sinologists in the State Department, the casting the field in such great suspicion in certain political quarters, and then
Well, you might be surprised at my answer. The cost was twofold. That loyal diplomats were persecuted and squeezed out of office when they were wrong on certain matters, but they were not disloyal. Unfortunately, there were communists in the FDR administration, and Senator McCarthy was too indiscriminate to know the difference. But the second result, George, was that the sinologists, as you call them, including people like John Fairbank, who'd been in government during World War II and then a long-time professor at Harvard, they were so bruised by the persecution that they did not make the distinction between disloyalty and mistakes. And it is possible to make that distinction.
Absolutely.
John Stuart Service and John Carter Vincent. I was later a tenant of John Carter Vincent in Cambridge when I arrived as a student from Australia. Got to know him very well. There was never a question of disloyalty, but they did misread Mao, and one can make both points. So why do I bring that up? Because the sinological community was wounded in an echo of the excesses of McCarthy. So it's one of those very unfortunate things that extremism can breed a little bit of extremism. So for instance, John Fairbank, who was my teacher, he defended a firebrand from Colorado called Agnes Smedley, who was one of the early journalist China hands. And it turns out in the Venona papers that Agnes Smedley was the second most important Soviet agent in China for years. And so mistakes were made on all sides.
That's invaluable right there, Ross. I mean, that bit of history, I think, for all watching and myself included, I deeply appreciate that. Speaking of looking at China in our day, March 2008, as we sit here, do correct me if I'm wrong, I know you will, but is it, Ross, your prescription for the way in which we look at China, that we, to put it simply, do it in a with a kind of a hard-headed analytical framework that puts American interests first?
I think you put it exactly right. And by the way, the Chinese have changed. The Chinese communists have changed, and they now know that they made a mistake in throwing their lot in with the Soviet Union in 1949. And they lost 25 years before getting onto the path of economic development.
Exactly.
And though the whole story hasn't yet come out in Beijing, Deng Xiaoping, who took over after the death of Mao in 1976, Deng Xiaoping was in many ways an anti-Mao. He buried the Maoism as social engineering, and he opened the door of China to the world, and he opened the economy to market forces. So the loss of China in 1949 was also, in a way, a big loss for the Chinese people.
Again, you bring us right to the point where I want to be, because in doing what Deng did, as you just described, and putting China on this path of economic development, he also, it seems to me, Ross, made this very unlikely marriage of this economic capitalism that has been so advantageous for the Chinese, while trying to, well, and in fact, retaining the communist nature of the government and the society. And I guess everyone's question is, how long can that last? Is that what we would call sustainable development in any real political sense?
Well, it's been very successful.
But it must have pressures.
And it's happened because of an event we haven't yet mentioned, the so-called Cultural Revolution, where Mao went to an extreme. He was becoming an old man. Mortality was beckoning. He distrusted his colleagues, and it was a lunge, as it were, a lunge for immortality for the revolution, which was out of anybody's reach.
It was coupled with his own lunge for immortality,
well,
wasn't
exactly.
it? He was sort of resisting the fact that he was going to die.
Exactly. And because it was so mistaken, it became Deng's springboard. He couldn't have done the bold things, after all, stock markets, stock exchanges, foreign investment, borrowing all around the world. The foreign money is a big part of China's economic boom, and Mao used to say, we're self-reliant, we're not going to have any foreign money. So Deng was able to use the disaster of the Cultural Revolution as a springboard to this contradiction that you've just called. My view is that you cannot separate economic freedom and political freedom for a sustained period. Now, there are two reasons why the Chinese are managing to do so. One is the philosophic frame of mind of China is not that of Russia. The Slavic mind cannot live with contradictions as readily as the yin-yang mind
of Confucian
of China. And the second reason, maybe more important, is they've learned from what happened to the Soviet Union. Deng Xiaoping was still in charge when the Soviet Union fell, and some of his colleagues wanted to use that to go back to semi-Maoism. That the Soviet Union had fallen because the West had subverted it with bourgeois ideas and Pope in Poland, all that kind of stuff. Deng said no. The Soviet Union fell because it didn't deliver the economic goods to the Russian people, and that began the current phase of saving Leninism with consumerism. It was Deng Xiaoping's great contribution to China. And your question, whether it will endure, I think doesn't obscure the fact that it has given China a breathing space. And many of my Chinese friends in Shanghai and Chongqing now, they don't care in the longer run what happens to the Chinese Communist Party. This period of a new society and a new economy will bear its fruit in China's future, one way or another, even if there's a political crisis between now and 50 years.
Let's discuss that. Again, you place us admirably for this question about that political future. I'm almost going to I will pose this in a Freudian sense. What does China want then? I mean, assuming that they can sustain this, and I like that explanation you've given us about the ability within the culture to combine opposites and make them productive for a long period of time. But where is this heading? I mean, where does the Chinese leadership and the leading elements of the Chinese people want this to go in terms of this obviously changing world position they're occupying?
Well, we have to answer that in terms of the Communist Party, because they are in charge. They brook no challenge to that. And there's a tacit pact with the public to make money and be religious, do anything except talk about politics. This is an eerie calm in a political culture which has lived by ideas and had a public philosophy, Confucianism being the main one, not the only one. And now it has, yes, technically a public philosophy, but it's not widely believed in, Marxism. So you have to point to the apparent fragility of that. But the tacit pact is working, and what the government wants is a peaceful environment in Asia, continuance of huge markets for the huge Chinese exports, and we are the #1 market, and they want a steady ship at home. They've got enormous problems of governance, George. 14 neighbours, 14
That's
abutting
right, that's
countries,
right.
and 3 more just across the water. And half of the territory, the western half, historically occupied by people who weren't Chinese. So keeping the ship steady at home, selling their products abroad, this is terribly important, which points to the corollary that continued economic growth is now a source of legitimacy for China. They've simply got to do it.
Right.
Mao used to despise that. Mm-hmm. When Khrushchev gave a speech in Budapest in the 50s about goulash communism, Khrushchev said to the Hungarians, judge your socialist government by whether it gives you a good plate of goulash. Mao was disgusted with this economism, he called it. But in fact, that's also Dengism
Exactly.
too.
I was just thinking as you said it.
And as the Marxism as an actual belief fades, economic results plus giving the Communist Party credit for the rise of China. There's a real spirit in China of pride that China's come to the forefront.
Yeah, yes, I have perceived that myself.
It will be seen in the Olympic Games this year. It's seen in the space program.
Right.
It's seen in the money the Communist Party has thrown to the archaeologists to find out that China's even older than the world thought.
Right.
And it's older than India, it's older than Egypt, all this kind of stuff.
Again, that's remarkable, and that sense of pride is palpable. I sense that, and I think we will, in fact, in August, see that demonstrated to the world in bright, glowing colors in every way. But speaking of the world and world opinion, let me introduce a subject area that has proved very problematic for China's action in the world vis-a-vis other countries, and that's the human rights question writ large. In 2 senses, Ross. One is, well, in the international sense, we can use the example of Darfur and the charges that China aids and abets the government of Sudan in China's search for resources. That's the kind of activity it's willing to support. That is the allegation. And then domestically, there are also charges that one of the ways in which China seeks to preserve its internal stability is through the repression of certain sectors. The press comes immediately to mind. Now, what's your sense of all of that and the attitude of the Chinese government to the criticism it receives on these grounds?
Having dealt with China for 40 years, I think they only answer to power. They compromised. They compromised with Richard Nixon because he offered them something. We'll stand against Soviet power together. They compromised later on over Taiwan because they wanted the American market, they wanted foreign investment, they wanted American know-how. But in Africa, in the surrounding areas like Burma, China's going to go its own way unless they're stopped. I myself do not think any kind of boycott to the Olympic Games would change change China's policy in Africa. And so I ask myself, why do it? We must put outcomes first. And you began your question by talking of human rights. China is not going to be a champion of human rights while China remains a Communist Party dictatorship. They don't, in a sense, they don't even know what human rights are. You can't have human rights without the rule of law, and you can't have the rule of law if the courts and the judges are subject to the instructions of the Communist Party. I'm afraid that's the blunt truth. So my attitude to the Olympics is let sport be sport. The democracies should insist on that. And if the authoritarian governments use it for state glory rather than for sporting reasons, well, we just have to hope that the world sees that and makes its own evaluation. What will change China's policies in Africa is when China starts to feel what it's like to get close to being number one. Other people resent you. Now, we Americans have experienced this for 50 or 60 years. The big beast of the jungle has his heels nipped at by the others, and China had no experience of this yet.
It's funny. I completely agree with that as an absolute, clearly a layperson with no particular China expertise. But I almost, to use the language of our political season, feel that they've gotten a free pass in world opinion because they're not number one yet. But I take it from you that as they get there or get close to that, that's going to change radically, and so will they.
And they are not equipped to be number one. The number one power has to have a message for the world. The British did with their institutions, their laws, their educational system. America's had a message of democracy and free markets. And Chinese pride alone is not an international message.
Ross, we're going to have to leave it there, but I can't imagine a better place, particularly that last sentence, that the number one power in the world has to have a message. That's what makes you number one. It's not just economic, it's not political. It has that. I think that's useful for us as Americans, it's useful for the Chinese, and it's just further proof of how great it is to talk with you on any subject. Thank you very much, Ross Terrill.
My pleasure, George.
Absolutely mine. That's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhzworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Ross Terrill.
The Art of Conversation, Dialogue at the Woodrow Wilson Center features 20 years of dialogue, distributed by the Johns Hopkins University Press, www.press.jhu.edu.